even though there was a reversal of the decision of the lower court, Gegner did continue to discriminate, and the activities in town continued. More picketing, the picketing had been escalated. Instead of just Saturday, there was almost daily picketing, and the result of the activities, Gegner really, who claimed that the major reason why he did not cut the hair of blacks was that he didn't know how, had become really sort of, more, I think, not necessarily racist, but I think his position hardened quite a bit. And it was after the lower court, the appeals court decision, Gegner decided to appeal to the Supreme Court. And this was in 63, 64, and 64, as I said, the activities around the barbershop had increased considerably. And it was the time that, resulting in the big demonstration, a so-called riot. And probably at this point I should stop and turn it over to Joni. Or Artie, did you wanted to?
Well, Paul has been covering it so well, a lot more thoroughly than I would have been able to cover it. Also, his role was more important than mine by a wide margin.
Louder, please.
So I remember a few things. I think I joined the Committee for Fair Practices in about 1955. I believe it was Al Stewart who talked to me, but it may have been Ed Churchill, Al was an alumnus. Ed Churchill was a faculty member of Antioch. And we met fairly regularly until finally one day Paul and I looked at each other and said, let's go in, and we went in tomorrow, the following day. During the period of the picketing, I was pleased that a number of people at YSI picketed along with myself and Harold Cordell and Ray Schiff and Leon Holster, many of whom you know. And also one of the frustrations about the melee that occurred, the big demonstration, was that I had gotten wind of this and I had tried to call the Greene County judges and legal authorities to brief them that something drastic was going to happen. Nobody answered the phone. Everybody was out of town. I haven't drawn a conclusion about that, but I've always had my suspicions. So in any event, the demonstration that I think should not have, the way in which it occurred, it should not have occurred. The bringing in of outside force in the way of law enforcement people, etc., was entirely overwhelming. And at the time, I was not in the middle of the demonstration, but I was on one side with James Lawson and Eugenia Lawson. James Lawson was the black mayor of Yellow Springs at the time. And we just put our arms around each other and wept. Still very hard for me to talk about it. Well, I think I've covered the high points of what I wanted to cover. Perhaps I should mention one other thing. The person whom many of you knew, that was my wife, Jean Davenport Trolander, was probably responsible for getting me involved in a lot of these things. Well, after we were married, I found out that her mother was a communist. Her father was a socialist. Her father had been one of the founders of the United Auto Workers well before the Luthers. And the cross had been burned on their front lawn. So I began realizing that I'd married into a very interesting family. Incidentally, her aunt, and Malvina Reynolds did a lot of folk song writing, including Little Boxes on the Hillside and things of that nature. And she was also a communist. Well, I think I've deviated enough from the program. I'll back off at this point.
I came to Antioch College in 1962, the fall. Since my brother here, my colleague, has deviated a little bit, I just want to tell you a little bit about my own attitude about Antioch. I actually had planned to go to Oberlin, or if not Oberlin, Michigan, because my love at the time was football. My father had been here, stationed at right field during the war, and he, I guess it's a father's prerogative or mother's, he drove me around to visit colleges. And as we were coming back from, actually Yale had been on the list too, coming back from a trip to Yale, Oberlin, and Michigan, as we were driving back to Chicago, he said, well, let's make a little side trip real quick down to Dayton. I want to see some people down there, and there's a little college down there that you ought to at least look at. Now, he planned that all along. So we shot down to here to Yellow Springs. He knew people here and had come here during the war often because this was the oasis in the desert for black folk working over at the field. You could get treatment here, as has been outlined by Brother Paul, in terms of facilities that were available. And we got here, and although I was a football player, I was fascinated by folk dancing. I'd never seen some stuff like that. So I decided to come later and came here. I got here, and James Dixon gave that talk that he gives for the first opening night in Kelly Hall, and he said, look in front of you, look behind you, look to your right, and look to your left. One of the 5 of you will graduate from Antioch College. Well, I got on the phone and said, Mama, Daddy, come get me, because I ain't got a damn chance in this. So I share that just to give you some perspective on my naivete in some ways. Although I came from a family of real activists. My father and my uncles were organizers, organized the Red Caps Union. One of my uncles was a lawyer who organized demonstrations against 4 open facilities at the University of Illinois in the 1940s, and had been jailed and then became the lawyer for ongoing demonstrations. Other uncles that worked with all kinds of other issues. So I had that in my background. And when Acres started having meetings here on campus, the Antioch Committee for Racial Equality, I think that was its term, I went to many of those meetings, and most of them, I didn't understand a lot of the issues that were going on because there were big internecine fights taking place at some point. But then they started mobilizing for demonstrating that spring of '63 against the barbershop. And I immediately got interested in that, in part because my friend and classmate Jim Fern was very mobilized for that, and also the older figure we had around this campus at that time, Hank Richardson, was another person who was very mobilized. And we met, I think we met 2 or 3 times. There were not a big group of African Americans to meet here at the college in those years. I think there were only 6 or 7 of us on college at that time, in the college. But we met and we decided we all wanted to definitely play a role in this. And I think if I recall from the newspaper constructs, Jim Fern's team, Jim and Hank Richardson demonstrated earlier, maybe the month or week before or something, and they were a team, and then Jim Fern got arrested. And then the next time was my time to come and get arrested with the group. And everything was to be done in a very disciplined. I remember people just hammering that down to us. Everything was to be totally nonviolent. And we couldn't swear, we couldn't do anything, couldn't hit this guy Gegner, nothing. So you got to remember, I was a football player, so this is required a little discipline on that part. Well, I remember us getting into the barbershop after we had walked down Xenia Avenue, and then he sort of put some of his friends up in front of the chair. Well, I knew the objective was the chair, so slipping through a line wasn't hard for me. So I managed to get into the chair and sit in the chair, at which point he very dramatically took the barber's apron and draped it over my head entirely as a sign of how adamantly he was not going to cut black folks' hair. And in fact, it's so specious an argument. I was pretty much bald-headed. There wasn't much hair to cut, if I recall correctly, at that time. So I stayed in the chair, did as I had been instructed and disciplined to do, and a policeman came over, had been brought in from outside by Gegner, and a policeman walked up to me in the chair and he said, "You are violating law, you have to get out of the chair." And I just looked at him, and then he dragged me basically out of the chair and then took me outside. Well, then by that point I said to myself, well, I better get ready to call my folks because this is going to be in jail and I want to get out that night. Well, at that point, James Lawson stepped forward and escorted me to the police. James Lawson, as my brothers have pointed out, was the mayor at that time. And I didn't know James. I had never really met him before. And he stepped forward and escorted me with Police Chief McKee on the other side, and they put me in the back of this cruiser. Well, in Chicago, if you get put in a police car, you just assume you're going to get your head whooped or something. But here then, we went from the barbershop over to City Hall, and they escorted me down to City Hall, and James sat down and said, "Whew, man, don't you want a drink?" James goes down in some drawer down there and pulled out this fifth of whiskey and poured us all a drink. And then I said, "Boy, this Yellow Sprigs is something else." It was the start of a wonderful friendship both with James and Sheriff McKee. And I think that the important thing that I would also add to this was that my recollection is going back for other demonstrations. And I want to reinforce the point that was made by Paul. I recall seeing the mobilizing of the other police forces coming in and of the tear gas. And I always wondered what really was involved with the summoning of all that extra firepower and police power to come in on this situation. I think some of it had to do with the great solidarity that we got from the Central State and Wilberforce students who really came out. This was one of the most wonderful things that I also took away from what was the beginnings of my being an activist. After that, I got more professional at it. Thank you very much.